Good morning, church. I want to talk to you today about something that we all struggle with: reactions. Life is full of moments where we feel provoked, misunderstood, or hurt. And in those moments, what do? We react. We lash out. We let our emotions dictate our next move. But I'm here to tell you there's a better way, a more powerful way. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is silently cut it off. There's something powerful about recognizing the emotional triggers in our lives. These are the moments, the words, or the people that push us to a place of reaction, often without us even realizing it. It's like a button gets pressed, and suddenly we're responding out of impulse rather than intentionality. This is something we all face, and it's a major part of why we struggle to maintain control in difficult situations. But let me tell you something. Emotional triggers aren't just random events. They reveal something deeper about our hearts, about our desires, our wounds, and the areas where we haven't fully surrendered to God yet. If you're feeling angry or frustrated or triggered, it's not just about the external situation. It's about what's happening inside of you. There's something God wants to reveal through that feeling, and it's not just about managing the emotion. It's about transforming the heart that's feeling it. Think about how Jesus responded to his own triggers. He was tempted, betrayed, and pushed to the edge, but he didn't react the way most people would. He had control. He was able to recognize the moment without being controlled by it. Jesus was secure in his identity and his purpose, so no matter how people tried to trigger him, he remained grounded. And he calls us to do the same. You see, recognizing your emotional triggers isn't about avoiding feelings or denying them. It's about being aware of the internal battle you're facing and understanding where your reaction comes from. Sometimes it's the fear of rejection that triggers us. Other times, it's the need for approval or control. Maybe it's past hurts that resurface, and before you know it, you're angry over something small because it reminded you of something deeper. When we recognize these triggers, we get the opportunity to respond instead of react. We get to choose whether we're going to act out of our flesh or choose to let the Spirit guide us. And this is key. Awareness precedes transformation. If we're not aware of what's happening inside of us, we can't move toward healing. If we're constantly reacting without understanding why we're triggered, we're stuck in the cycle. Let's look at a practical example. Maybe someone at work says something that frustrates you, and instantly you feel your heart rate rise. Maybe they question your work or they make a dismissive comment, and you feel the anger bubbling up. If you don't recognize that trigger, you're likely to react defensively. You might respond with harsh words, or you might shut down entirely. But if you take a moment to recognize what's happening inside, you can ask yourself, why is this affecting me so deeply? What part of me feels disrespected? What wound in me hasn't healed yet? By acknowledging your triggers, you create space to process and pray before you react. You ask God for wisdom in the moment, for peace where there's unrest, and for the strength to act with grace instead of anger. When you're aware of what's going on inside of you, the Holy Spirit can help you address the root cause instead of just dealing with the surface level emotion. The goal is not to suppress your emotions, but to manage them in a way that honors God. When we don't recognize our triggers, we're like a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. But when we're aware, we can walk in the freedom that comes from emotional maturity. God doesn't want us to be reactionary. He wants us to be responsive in His Spirit, to live in a way that's not controlled by external circumstances or emotions, but rooted in His peace. There is something incredibly powerful about silence. In a world that is constantly filled with noise, the ability to remain silent in moments of conflict or tension is an act of profound strength. People often associate silence with weakness, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Silence is a weapon, a tool that when used correctly can lead to victory in battles that don't require our words. When we choose silence, it's not about giving in. It's about choosing the right moment to speak, or better yet, choosing the right time to not speak at all. Silence is an intentional decision to withhold your words in a way that forces the other side to come face to face with the reality of their actions. It's a way of saying, I don't need to argue with you. I don't need to prove my point. I don't need to defend myself. Think about how often we react impulsively to situations because we feel the need to be heard. We feel the need to correct the person who's wrong, to clarify our position, to make sure everyone knows we're right. But the Bible tells us that sometimes we don't need to defend ourselves at all. In fact, in some situations, the most powerful response is no response. Silence gives you the power to remove yourself from the situation and leave it in God's hands. One of the most compelling examples of this is Jesus during his trial. When the religious leaders brought him before Pilate, accusing him of crimes he didn't commit, he didn't speak in his defense. Pilate, confused by Jesus' silence, even asked him, "Don't you hear the testimony they are bringing against you?" And yet, Jesus remained silent. He didn't engage in a debate. He didn't try to convince Pilate of his innocence. He understood that silence was a part of the plan, a demonstration of his trust in the Father's will and timing. In the same way, when we face situations where people are attacking us or misrepresenting us, we have the choice to react or to remain silent. Silence can be a declaration that we trust God to be our advocate. We don't need to defend ourselves because we know that He's already fighting for us. Silence doesn't mean we're passive. It means we're active in surrendering our need to control the situation and trusting God to handle it on our behalf. There's also something powerful about the peace that silence brings. When we don't react in the heat of the moment, when we step back and take a breath before speaking, we create space for God to bring clarity. In the midst of chaos, silence brings perspective. We stop looking at the situation with human eyes and start looking at it from God's vantage point. Silence forces us to listen to God, to ourselves, and to the situation around us. It allows us to pause and say, God, what do you want me to do in this moment? Silence also reveals strength and restraint. When people expect you to retaliate, to snap back, to engage in their drama, and you choose silence, it's a bold move. It's not an easy choice, but it's a powerful one. It says that you are so secure in who you are that you don't need to stoop down to their level. You are willing to let God handle what only He can handle, and in doing so, you remain in a position of peace and authority. But silence isn't just about staying quiet in conflict. It's about creating space for God to move in every aspect of our lives. There's a spiritual discipline in being still before God, in waiting for His voice. It's in the silence that God can speak to us most clearly. We're not distracted by our own thoughts, our emotions, or the noise of the world around us. We can hear the whispers of God guiding us, leading us, and comforting us. In relationships, silence can also be a tool of growth. We live in a culture that constantly demands instant responses and quick decisions, but sometimes the most loving thing we can do is give someone the space they need. When we remain silent, we allow others to process their feelings without pressure. It shows maturity to let things settle, to wait before responding, and to give others the opportunity to reflect on their actions. It doesn't mean we're ignoring them. It means we're offering them the respect of time and consideration. Choosing silence may feel unnatural in a world that prizes instant reactions, but when we understand the power of silence, we begin to see it not as a sign of weakness, but as a reflection of wisdom. It's the quiet strength that chooses peace over conflict, surrender over struggle, and trust over fear. Silence doesn't mean we're disengaged. It means we're actively trusting God to speak and move in ways that we cannot. There's a deep and profound truth that many of us overlook. God is fighting for us. When we find ourselves in the middle of conflict, confusion, or challenges, it's easy to believe we are alone in the battle, that we must fight it on our own, or that we have to figure it out by ourselves. But the reality is, God is already in the fight, and He's on our side. When we look at Scripture, we see countless examples of God stepping into battles on behalf of His people. Take the story of the Israelites in Exodus 14:14. They were trapped between the Red Sea and the pursuing Egyptian army, a hopeless situation in human terms. The people were afraid, and understandably so. Death seemed certain. But then Moses said something powerful: "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." God didn't ask them to pick up arms or strategize a way out. He asked them to trust in His power and presence. And what happened? God parted the sea and delivered them in a way they couldn't have imagined. This is the kind of God we serve. The battle you face may feel overwhelming, but it's never bigger than the power of God. We're often tempted to react impulsively when trouble comes our way, whether through anger, worry, or fear. But God calls us to rest in His promise that He is already at work. He fights on our behalf, and He fights with authority that no enemy can stand against. Think about David and Goliath. David, a young shepherd, faced a giant that no one else had the courage to confront. Everyone else saw the size of the problem, the strength of the enemy, but David understood something crucial. The battle belonged to God, not him. David wasn't relying on his own strength or skill. He was trusting that God would show up. And God did. With a single stone, God brought down the giant that had taunted Israel for 40 days. It wasn't David's strategy that won the battle, it was God's intervention. God fought for him. The battle you're facing might not be physical like David's, but the principles are the same. It could be a battle in your mind, a struggle in your relationships, or an overwhelming circumstance at work. God is fighting for you in ways you can't always see. He's moving behind the scenes, preparing paths, opening doors, and shutting down the schemes of the enemy that you might never even be aware of. There's something incredibly freeing about realizing this truth, that the pressure is not on you to win every battle. It's not on your shoulders to solve every problem. God takes the weight of the fight off of you. When we fight on our own strength, we grow tired, frustrated, and often disillusioned. But when we let God fight for us, we can rest in His faithfulness. We can stand firm in the confidence that He has already gone before us. The Apostle Paul reminds us of this in Romans 8:31, where he says, "If God is for us, who can be against us?" This isn't just a nice feel-good verse to comfort us when we're struggling. This is a declaration of truth. If God is fighting for us, then no enemy, no circumstance, no force in the universe can defeat us. When we understand this, it changes how we approach challenges. We don't fight out of fear, we fight out of faith, knowing that God is at the helm. But what does it look like to let God fight for us? It's not about being passive or complacent. It's about surrender. It's about aligning our hearts with God's will and trusting that His ways are higher than our own. It's about standing firm in His promises, not in our own abilities. When we're in the middle of a storm, it's easy to start trying to control everything, to fight the battle ourselves. But God is asking us to give it to Him and trust that He will move in His perfect timing and power. There are moments in life when all we can do is be still and let God take over. This is not weakness, but a strength of trust. When you stop striving and start surrendering, you open the door for God's supernatural intervention. God's way of fighting isn't like ours. It's far more effective. His power works in ways we can't comprehend, and His timing is always right. When we give God control, we are acknowledging that He is bigger than any obstacle we face. We are declaring that we trust in His sovereignty, His wisdom, and His love. And most importantly, we're recognizing that the victory is not ours to claim, but His. God fights for us because He loves us. He's not just standing by, watching us struggle. He is actively engaged in the battle, working for our good. When we allow God to fight our battles, we experience peace that passes understanding. We realize that we are not alone in the fight. We are not helpless. We are more than conquerors through Him who loves us. It's God's power that makes the difference, not our ability to fight. Peace is one of the most precious things we can have in this chaotic world. It's easy to overlook just how valuable it is until we find ourselves in a season of turmoil. Whether it's a relationship falling apart, a challenging work situation, or the stress of daily life piling up. In those moments, we can quickly see how much we take peace for granted and how quickly it can be disrupted. But God has called us to a life of peace, and He wants us to protect that peace with everything we've got. Peace isn't just the absence of conflict. It's a deep, abiding sense of calm and trust in God, regardless of the storms around us. It's the ability to stand firm in the midst of chaos, knowing that God is in control. Peace comes from knowing that no matter what happens, God is sovereign and trustworthy. It's a confidence that He's working all things together for our good, even when we don't understand what's happening. But protecting that peace means guarding it like a treasure. One of the first ways we protect our peace is by being mindful of the voices we allow into our lives. In today's world, there are so many distractions and so many opinions. Everywhere we look, someone is trying to tell us what we should think, feel, or do. And while it's important to listen to wise counsel, we also have to be discerning about the sources of information that bring us peace and those that steal it. Not everything that we hear is from God. Some voices bring fear, anxiety, and confusion. And when we listen to those voices too much, it's like we're opening the door for chaos to invade our hearts. In the Bible, Paul encourages us to focus on things that bring life and peace. Whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Philippians 4:8. When we allow negativity, gossip, or anything that stirs up worry or anger to dominate our thoughts, we're letting those things invade our peace. It's crucial to protect our minds and hearts by carefully choosing what we let in. Not every battle is ours to fight, and not every piece of information is ours to absorb. Some things, some people, and some situations are better left in God's hands. We can't afford to let our peace be contaminated by every negative influence that comes our way. Another key to protecting our peace is setting boundaries. We often don't realize how much peace we lose by saying yes to too many things. We can easily find ourselves overwhelmed by the demands of others, constantly running around trying to please everyone and do everything. But the truth is, peace requires space. It requires time for rest, for reflection, and for recharging our spirits. Jesus himself understood the importance of retreating to a quiet place to pray and reconnect with the Father. In Mark 1:35, we read that very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Jesus knew the importance of protecting his peace by stepping away from the demands of others and seeking the Father in solitude. We must do the same. We can't keep pouring into others if we're not filling ourselves with peace from the source. There's also an aspect of protecting our peace that involves letting go of control. We often want to control our circumstances, our relationships, and even the people around us, thinking that if we can just make everything work the way we want, we'll find peace. But the reality is, true peace comes when we release control and trust God with the outcomes. Jesus tells us in Matthew 11:28 and 30, "I'll come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." When we try to carry the weight of the world on our own shoulders, we lose our peace. But when we surrender our worries and give them to God, we find the peace that only He can provide. Sometimes protecting your peace means saying no to toxic people or situations. Not everyone in your life is meant to be a part of your journey to peace. There are relationships that drain you, situations that pull you into unnecessary drama, and patterns that keep you stuck in anxiety. It's okay to step back from things and people that steal your peace. Jesus himself didn't engage with every person or situation that came his way. He knew where to focus his energy and where to step away. In Luke 10:38-42, we read the story of Mary and Martha. Martha was so caught up in the distractions and demands of hospitality that she missed the opportunity to sit at Jesus' feet and experience peace. Mary, on the other hand, chose the better part by resting in his presence. We need to learn to prioritize peace, just like Mary did. Sometimes we have to step away from the chaos and sit at the feet of Jesus, allowing him to renew our minds and hearts. The last thing I want to say about protecting your peace is that it comes from knowing that peace is not something we create on our own. It's a gift from God. And it's something we must nurture through our relationship with him. The world's peace is fleeting and circumstantial, but the peace that God offers is unshakable. It's peace that guards our hearts and minds, even in the most difficult times. We must intentionally seek God and trust in his promises to experience that peace on a daily basis. The more we connect with him, the more his peace will overflow into every area of our lives. Setting boundaries is one of the most important things we can do for our emotional, mental, and spiritual well-being. It's about knowing your limits and protecting yourself from things, people, and situations that drain you, manipulate you, or take you off course. Boundaries are not walls to isolate us from others, but protective lines that help us maintain healthy relationships and keep our peace intact. When we understand the power of boundaries, we understand that they are essential to living a life of purpose and balance. At its core, setting boundaries is about knowing where your responsibility ends and where someone else's begins. Too often, we get caught in the trap of feeling responsible for other people's emotions, actions, or choices. But you cannot be all things to all people. God did not design you to carry the weight of everyone else's burdens. He wants us to love, support, and care for others, but He also wants us to do so from a place of health, not depletion. Think about the example of Jesus. He was constantly surrounded by people who needed something from Him, whether it was healing, teaching, or emotional support. Yet Jesus knew when to withdraw. In Mark 1:35, we read that very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where He prayed. Jesus understood the importance of stepping back to recharge and reconnect with the Father. He set boundaries for Himself to maintain His strength and focus on His mission. If Jesus, the Son of God, needed to set boundaries, how much more do we need them in our own lives? Setting boundaries isn't just about saying no to others. It's also about saying yes to your own well-being. Many people struggle with guilt when it comes to setting limits. We worry that we'll disappoint others or that they'll think less of us. But the truth is, setting healthy boundaries is an act of self-care and self-respect. It's about recognizing that you have value and that taking care of yourself enables you to be more effective in serving others. If we constantly pour from an empty cup, we're not serving anyone, including ourselves. Boundaries allow us to serve from a place of fullness, not exhaustion. We see this in the Apostle Paul's writings as well. In 2 Corinthians 6:11-13, Paul talks about the importance of establishing emotional and relational boundaries. We have spoken freely to you, Corinthians, and opened wide our hearts to you. We are not withholding our affection from you, but you are withholding yours from us. As a fair exchange, I speak as to my children. Open wide your hearts also. Here Paul is saying that while he's poured his heart out to the Corinthians, he can't force them to reciprocate. There's an emotional boundary he has to maintain, and this allows him to protect his heart from being drained by unreciprocated love or affection. Setting boundaries also means knowing when to walk away from toxic situations. There are times when we need to distance ourselves from harmful relationships or environments in order to preserve our peace and mental health. This isn't about being rude or unloving, but rather about recognizing that staying in certain situations can do more harm than good. When we set boundaries in these areas, we're not just protecting ourselves, we're also creating space for healthier, more life-giving relationships. It's also important to note that boundaries protect our time and energy. In a world that constantly demands more from us, it's easy to become overcommitted. People ask us to do things, and we say yes because we want to be helpful or liked. But when we don't set boundaries around our time, we end up exhausted, resentful, and unproductive. Healthy boundaries allow us to prioritize the things that truly matter: our relationship with God, our families, and our purpose, without getting lost in the endless demands of others. Setting boundaries isn't always easy, especially when we feel the pressure to please others or when we fear conflict. However, boundaries are not meant to create division, but to foster respect and understanding. When we set clear and healthy boundaries, we communicate to others that we value ourselves and our time. We teach others how to treat us, and we give them the space to respect our needs as we respect theirs. Another aspect of setting boundaries is learning to say no without feeling guilty. Saying no is not a sign of selfishness, it's a sign of strength. By saying no to something that isn't aligned with our values or priorities, we're saying yes to our own health, peace, and well-being. It's important to recognize that every time you say yes to something, you are, by default, saying no to something else. The key is to choose wisely and in surety.